today's World Insight with Tian Wei, China and Europe, what can they do together to shape global trade? Will the 8th Hamburg Summit provide answers? And a threat of force against migrants on the border. Is Washington adding fuel to the fire? Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. We begin our show today in Europe, where Chinese Vice Premier Liu He is on a 3-day visit to Germany. He also attended the 8th Hamburg Summit, a leading economic conference on China-Europe affairs. Before we get down to business, let's take a look at this.
Officials, scholars, and entrepreneurs from China and Germany are meeting in the city of Hamburg to discuss economic cooperation against the backdrop of rising protectionism. Chinese Vice Premier Liu He delivered a keynote address at the summit. The China Proposed Belt and Road Initiative takes center stage at the 2-day gathering, which is themed Hamburg Summit China Meets Europe. In an opening speech on Monday, former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder said the opportunities created by the Belt and Road Initiative will bring people and businesses in Asia and Europe closer together. This summit was initiated by the Hamburg Chamber of Commerce in 2004, aiming to help China and Europe enhance their economic relations through dialogue. 2018 marks the 14th consecutive year since the European Union became China's largest trading partner, and China, the EU's second largest export market and largest source of imports. The bilateral trade volume between China and the EU rose 13.4% to about $401 billion from January through July this year. The EU's investment in China also surged to $8.5 billion by the end of September. That was an increase of 22.3% year-on-year. Amid a complex and volatile international landscape, both China and Europe seek to counter isolationism with more exchange and cooperation.
More discussion on the China-EU relations, particularly when it comes to trade and economic ties. In our Beijing studio, Liu Mingli, Deputy Director of the Institute of European Studies with the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. In Shanghai, we have Maximilian Reck, who is a Professor of International Affairs and Program Director of ESCA Shanghai. In Brussels, we have Peter Klepp, Head of the Brussels office, Open Europe. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to go to you directly, Mr. Reck. Professor, help us understand what does this mean when China and Europe vow together to talk and discuss about the rule-based international trade system within the WTO?
Yes. As a matter of fact, both China and Europe, and more particularly Germany, are very much interested in an open and free trade system that is underpinned by the WTO. Now, what we're currently looking at is a potentiality of reforming the WTO. As you know, last Friday, the European Union, China and India have submitted proposals to initiate reforms of the WTO, and I think that is a very good sign. That is a very good sign for a continued free and open trade system that both the far ends of Eurasia on the west and on the east are interested in maintaining. So this is something that we have to work on together, and I think that Liu He coming to Germany to discuss this ahead of the Buenos Aires G20 meeting is a very good start for the negotiations which are going to go forward for the next couple of months.
I see. Mr. Klepp, though, we see the EU earlier with the Brexit issue somewhat cleared up, even though we do not know the result yet. But the EU, how capable is it now, with Germany, for example, and France playing leading roles, be able to discuss international trade mechanism with China?
Well, the EU is still very active in trade, more active than ever, I would say. Indeed, they are on the verge of concluding a Brexit deal with the UK, but also the European Union has managed to close a trade deal with Japan. and before that with Canada. And currently one of the priorities is to try to save the WTO, the World Trade Organization, because President Trump is refusing to appoint any new judges there. So the fears are that from next year on there would be no dispute settlement system or no functioning dispute settlement system anymore in the WTO. Of course, the EU is very keen to avoid a full-out trade war between China and the US, because this would also hurt the EU badly.
Right. Mr. Liu, listening to your European colleagues, I'm sure you have your own views about what kinds of cooperation is it that China could seek with the European countries and also the EU as well when it comes to this rule-based international trade system, Mr. Liu.
I think the international rule-based system is very important for both EU and China, and for the time being, I think with this summit in Hamburg, I think both sides can see a very positive signal to the world economy that EU and China are going to the right direction, the direction of cooperation rather than in confrontation. We know Europe and China are big economies in the world. If the two sides take protectionism measures at the global stage, I think that will be economic disaster for the whole economy. I think both sides, EU and China, has drawn lesson from the Great Recession in 1920s. So it's a good signal for Europe and China to send to the world economy. And in the future, I think concrete measures could be expected during this summit. I think many scholars and business leaders are working hard for this summit, and concrete measures could be expected.
Right. Professor Reck, of course, you heard from both the Chinese Vice Premier Liu He and also from Gerhard Schroeder, who's the honorary chairman of the conference, talking about cooperation always better than confrontation, despite differences that could exist between economies and among economies. Professor Reck, of course, this is taking place with the backdrop of U.S.-China apparent trade war and leading up to the G20 summit, in which the two presidents of the two countries likely to meet to ease the tension, at least in the trade. So, Professor Reck, when you heard China and some of the leading figures in Europe talking about this together, almost in the same tone, how much is it giving us confidence and resolve to the issue at all, Professor Reck?
No, I agree with you. I think, first of all, it's important to understand that communication is key. So talking is important. We know that our Foreign Minister Heiko Maas has been in Beijing only early on this month, in early November, and the German government is always very much interested in maintaining an open channel of communication with China, with the United States, and with other important trade partners around the world, most notably the Europeans. If we look at the fundamentals of the relationship between Germany and China, then we do see that we have a very prosperous trading relationship. We exchange some 186 billion euros, so probably a little bit more in US dollars. But if you look at the import and the export, the relationship is not as unbalanced. What does that mean? That means that Germany is actually not afraid to trade with China. We don't think that it is something negative. We see it as something very positive. So with a balanced trade relationship, that is something where we can build upon and where we can move forward. Now, you know that with the United States, the People's Republic of China maintains a trade balance which is much more unbalanced and in that sense not very healthy, maybe. And this is, I think, why in terms of the rhetoric that comes out of the White House, it is sometimes a little bit more confrontational. Now, Tian Wei, you have mentioned confrontation. You have mentioned the difficult situation that we're currently facing. And I think that the European Union can have a very constructive, or can play a very constructive role in reforming the WTO. The proposals are on the table, but also try to engage China and engage the United States at the same time, to arrive at a more, solution which is more cooperative in the future. And that's something that we need.
Professor Reck, I heard that kind of similar tones earlier, but the question is how? Is that wishful thinking for Europe or the European Union to be able to play a part in resolving the trade tension between China and the United States? After all, it was the first and the second largest economy in the world that are apparently in a trade dispute. And secondly, what role exactly is the EU or the major European capital cities are thinking about when it comes to their roles within the WTO? Can you be a little bit specific rather than abstract, Professor Reck?
Sure. As a matter of fact, if you think about what exactly needs to be resolved, it needs to be resolved to have all the member states of the WTO, the member countries, represented according to their share in the world economy. But apart from that, I think it is important to act within the international institutions. So what exactly needs to be done? We know that the dispute settlement mechanism is currently in a little bit of difficulty with regards to appointing new lawyers that can make up the appellate body. And here we need to go and provide, as the European Union has suggested on Friday last week, provide maybe a mandate which could be for a single appointment only and for a longer time period than previously. So not 2 times 4 years, but 1 time 6 to 8 years.
Okay.
This is a very useful solution. But the United States has one more very important concern, and that is investment from China and the unbalanced relationship with regards to trade. I think that Europe has the very same concerns. So what should we do? We should create a level playing field for our companies, and in this level playing field, in a market which is characterized by equal access to each other's consumer markets, in this kind of environment we can thrive. So creating a level playing field, reforming the WTO according to the suggestions that have been put forward, that would be a good way forward. And then we can have a situation which is more positive and maybe less hostile in the next couple of years.
I see. And Mr. Liu here from China, of course you would jump in on this occasion to help us understand China's understanding of some of the major European capitals' function in this regard, whether it is about trade ties between China and the United States or the overall, shall we say, improvement of the WTO. With the current crisis, which is the appellate body almost collapsed at the very beginning of next year because of the United States refused to appoint judges to the appellate body. And Mr. Liu, what exactly can they play?
Yes, I think Europeans' positions are important because European is a big #1 economy in the world, and Europeans according to my own observation, Europe has been playing a role of reform of the WTO. As far as I know, last year in May, European Commission has launched a paper called Harnessing the Globalization, with lay out the European position about WTO. According to European Commission, I think there are some areas which is not managed by the WTO, so the European Union want to reform it. And I think the position is important because for the time being, when we talk about the WTO, because it will maybe in crisis next year because the block of the new nominees of the judges of the panel. So European position are important, particularly for EU and China to get a consensus. And I think, yes, I think we have different views from US, from European Union, and from China. I think it's important for the EU and China to get consensus. Otherwise, maybe the WTO may be in crisis next year.
So, Mr. Liu, if I could follow up about exactly China is thinking, I mean, from your scholar's perspective, I mean, besides interpret it and say it in a different way? Is there much difference in terms of stance between the EU and the United States when it comes to pushing China about trade and economic ties in certain nature? That's one question, of course. Secondly is how much negotiating power or impact does really Brussels or other major European capital cities having on Washington at all? I mean, after all, will the EU or major European capital cities just become a force pushing China rather than the other way also, which is having an impact on the decision-making process of Washington? Mr. Liu.
I think why the WTO is complicated because the U.S. and the EU have both consensus and differences. And the consensus is that they have similar demand for China. For example, how to manage the overcapacity and the subsidies, which is not included in previous WTO regulation. And the difference is that, according to my observation, U.S. want to rebuild the WTO. If they cannot be satisfied, maybe they will pull out of the WTO. For the European Union, I think the European Union wants to stay in the WTO. They want to maintain this mechanism. That's the major difference. So both China, EU, and US have both similar positions and differences. So the reform is very complicated.
It is very complicated, and that's the fascinating part of it, isn't it, when it comes to this discussion? Mr. Klepp, of course, the European capitals do not see eye to eye with one another either. If you think about Germany, of course, it's one of the biggest exporting country within the European Union. However, for example, France and some of the other economies are thinking differently. And also between Europe, Germany and others, also there are differences about where they should stand in trade. Obviously, different countries have different advantages and they want to protect their best interests. So in that regard, Mr. Klepp, help us understand how strong is the negotiation stance of Europe as a whole. And meanwhile, how much Germany will be able to achieve some kinds of persuasive power toward China given its current position now within the EU? Mr. Klepp.
Well, it's absolutely correct what you're saying, that there are big differences on trade policy between European countries. So you have the more liberal countries, you have the more protectionist countries. Some liberal countries may become more protectionist when a big part of their industry is facing competition. Now, I would not phrase this as winning or losing. You know, it's about trade. So ultimately, when you open up trade, the consumer has to be taken into account. So if you would see it as a concession, if Europe would open up more than China, for example, then that would be, I think, the wrong view. It would be a win for European consumers and would be a loss for Chinese consumers. Of course, there are some issues in Europe. People are concerned about the fact that China is still, to a certain degree at least, a state-led economy. We can disagree on to what extent, but to a certain degree it definitely still is, about things like intellectual property, rights protection. And then people are wondering, should we actually open up competition to an economy that is largely state-driven, while we do not allow this at home in Europe? And I don't think there's an easy answer to give on that. But that discussion can easily be avoided if China would only move in the direction of more of a free market economy, which it has actually done to a great extent in the last 30 years. So if that process continues, then I don't think there's any concern about EU protectionism.
Right. Mr. Liu from China, you want to respond to your colleagues, first of all. Secondly, if I could bring in another topic, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, which involves China's cooperation with the European countries a lot. And that could be, some say, a new momentum for investments and also cooperation projects, not only inside the European economies, but also going to the third parties, for example, to Africa, to Latin America. And Mr. Liu, how much chance really is there that Europe and Chinese economies can really be able to build, particularly within a short period of time, given the complicated situation we're facing right now, both Europe and China?
I think that there are a lot more EU and China could do, particularly under the framework of Belt and Road Initiative. I think according to my observation, European Union's attitude toward this initiative has been changing. During the first years, I think the European Union does not know well about the initiative, and later they may have some doubt or concerns about it. And recently I found many European countries, including Germany, have a strong interest in this initiative. For example, the location of this summit in Hamburg. Hamburg is a big port of Germany, and it enjoys the Belt and Road Initiative. It has more export destinations, and EU and China also can work under the background of third-party cooperation. Because, for example, France, China can work together in Africa because many countries there are French-speaking, and France knows well in this area, and China and Spain can work together in Latin America. Similarly, I think there are a lot more EU and China could do.
Professor Reck, you know, it used to be said that trade and economic ties are the pillar of relations between countries and economies. But given the recent circumstances, it seems that that theory has been experiencing some test, to say the least. As a result of that, how is it this discussion between China and the European economies, this time, of course, in Hamburg Summit, likely to help us clarify what exactly will be the role of trade and economic ties between countries and in the global debate about where to go in geopolitics, Professor Reck?
Yes. Thank you, Tianwei. I think the questions that you just posed very much allude to one fact which we have to bear in mind. I think forums like the Hamburg Summit, China Meets Europe, provide an opportunity for civil society, for business leaders, but also for the Young Leaders Forum to get to know each other. And there they could look at the specific elements in trade and investment where we can actually add value. You mentioned the Belt Road Initiative just early on with Professor Liu. The Belt Road Initiative can be a very positive building block for further cooperation in the future. But you cannot forget that sometimes US companies, Chinese companies and European companies are in competition to each other. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is where can competing companies cooperate along the Belt Road Initiative? And this co-opetition, where we're competing in some markets but cooperate in other markets, would be the way forward. And here we have to ask ourselves, okay, what are our strengths? What can we bring to the table? What is the added value that a German company such as Mr. Liu, Professor Liu has mentioned, the Port of Hamburg, they have perfect project management in the Port of Hamburg. They have software which can facilitate trade, which can render container terminals so much more efficient. And if we are able to implement the very same technology in other countries around the world, be it in Sri Lanka or be it in the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, or be it in Kenya, then this, I think, is a positive way forward. So ask yourself, take one step back, ask yourself, where can we add value and where can we cooperate, and that is what we should focus on.
Well, that is about trade and economic ties, but what about the overall? Trade and economic ties can play in bilateral, multilateral relationship. Mr. Clapp, I have to tap your expertise in that. Geopolitics is evolving very fast these days as we speak. Almost every month you see dramatic change and attitudes shifting. So what about that? The role of trade and economic ties still relevant for building better ties between countries and economies?
Well, it's been said that if goods do not cross borders, armies will. So this is the cornerstone of peace in the world, to allow companies to trade across border and not only create wealth but also create interdependence and stability. It is not sufficient. I mean, before the First World War you had a lot of trade and still the world slipped into war. But I think it's a necessary condition for global peace. Now I want to maybe mention one more thing about the Belt and Road Initiative. I think that's absolutely one example of the concerns that many Europeans will give when they refer to China as a source of unfair competition. So I'm really not so sure if this is a good initiative, because it will be used as an excuse, I think, to put up barriers against China, whereas what we've seen is that many of these projects, just like, of course, big EU projects, when they're funded by EU governments, have turned into white elephants. So I think China should probably reflect if this is really the best instrument to promote trade, and if it maybe should not instead rely on more traditional forms of promoting trade, for example, stepping up efforts to conclude trade deals. There still is no trade deal between the European Union and China, and both sides could dramatically gain from that.
That's true. There's still no free trade deals, for example, between China and Europe. Mr. Liu, you want to jump in about your colleague's comment about the Belt and Road Initiative, first of all?
Yes, I'd like to respond to the colleagues in Shanghai. But I think why the Road Initiative is so the interest of both Europe and China. For example, let's take Hamburg example. I know that the management in Hamburg port is good. I know that, but Hamburg port needs business, and for Belt and Road Initiative means more business, more exportation, more shipping to the Hamburg. I think that will be so the interest of Hamburg, and also I think there are also other opportunities for China and Germany to work with each other. For example, the infrastructure building. Belt and Road Initiative means more connectivity, means more infrastructure project. And I know many German enterprises are competitive, and they have a strong interest in the infrastructure building. They want to get involved in this project. I think the German enterprise don't want to be excluded from this project. That's also an opportunity for EU, for China and Germany to work together. I think that's a win-win initiative.
Isn't that interesting, Mr. Liu? I mean, I pick up from the earlier conversations and discussions with some of the business people from Europe, for example, different economies. On the one hand, the so-called public opinion and also media coverage of the Belt and Road Initiative is relatively somewhat negative, particularly recently. And yet, business are very eager to jump on whatever opportunity this Belt and Road Initiative could create, even though that could mean from time to time competition in some of the markets. How would you read this very mixed picture, and particularly at the very early stage of Belt and Road Initiative? After all, if you think about it, from the initiative was raised until now, it's less than 5 years. And during the 5 years, as we all know, not many infrastructure projects could be built within such period of time, not to mention its impact that could be seen. So, Mr. Liu, how do you read these mixed pictures?
It's really interesting. Europeans have a different opinion about the Belt and Road Initiative. Actually, about 4 years ago, when I visited Europe, I found only a few people know the word Belt and Road Initiative. They don't know this at all. Recently, more and more people know this project, this initiative, but they have different views. I think one of the major reasons of the differences is that how the Belt and Road Initiative was covered in the European media. Because if we focus on the positive side, I think many Europeans will know for a positive way. Because I think most people they have never visited China. They have knowledge about the Belt and Road Initiative. Whatever Europe still is just part of the Belt and Road Initiative. But we don't know that, so we need positive.
Right. Before we go, I do want to ask you also, before we go, Professor Reck, I mean, on the one hand, you see this China-German Hamburg Summit. On the other hand, you see Earlier, Chinese premier was interacting with many of the leaders of the European economies. And in a few days, Chinese President Xi Jinping is going to visit some of the other European countries, Spain, for example, Portugal, for example. You see these very frequent interactions between China and the Europeans. I do wonder what kind of message is this being sent to both the capitals between these two sides and also to the others, Professor Reck, before we go.
Yes. Yes. No, I think that both China and Europe are very rich in terms of the different cities, in terms of the different countries, or in China the provinces. And so we should think of a couple of bilateral relationships between the European Commission, for example, and Beijing. But on the other hand, we also have more than that. There's 27 member states of the European Union, which are all very happy to interact with their Chinese partners, whether they are in Portugal, in Spain, or in Germany. So in that sense, I think that the relationship goes beyond just high-level diplomatic delegations.
Right.
There's actually even the people that are interacting with each other, getting to know each other better. And I hope that this can actually lead to a better understanding in the future, because I do agree with you. Sometimes public opinion is characterized by mistrust and a lack of understanding. And the more we know about each other, I think the more we can actually learn from each other and potentially in the future have a better understanding and better cooperation forward.
Okay, I hope we start at least from discussions and even debates like this, as we have just put out for our audience worldwide. Thank you so much for the three of you. Even though you have very different opinions on issues, I really appreciated your insights. And Maximilian Reck, Peter Klepp, Liu Ming Li. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on the program, a threat of force against the migrants on the border. Is Washington adding fuel to the fire? Some ask. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The migrant caravan that U.S. President Donald Trump rallied against during the midterm elections has finally arrived after U.S. Border Patrol fired tear gas at migrants on Sunday. Mexico is now asking Washington for a full investigation into what it called non-lethal weapons directed towards Mexican territory. Let's take a look.
This, the U.S.-Mexico border on Sunday, a major crossing at San Isidro near San Diego. Would-be asylum seekers throwing projectiles over the border wall, some trying to make a run for it and get across. Border guards responding with tear gas, and cars backed up for several kilometers as officials closed this busy crossing. U.S. President Donald Trump, Mexico should move the flag-waving migrants, many of whom are stone-cold criminals, back to their countries. Do it by plane, do it by bus, do it any way you want, but they are not coming into the USA. We will close the border permanently if need be. Congress, fund the wall. The day had begun peacefully, with thousands of migrants now in the Mexican border town of Tijuana. They're part of several caravans of people desperate to be admitted into the United States, traveling for weeks from Central American countries, mainly Honduras. And now many in Mexico said to be growing angry over the migrants' presence. The Mexican government saying more than 36 migrants were arrested this weekend and promising to deport those who try to rush the U.S. border. Mexican officials claim to have sent more than 11,000 home over the past month and say total deportations to Central America for the year are expected to hit 100,000. But migrants keep arriving. They say they have nowhere else to go, and they pray that the U.S. will let them in. Washington insisting it will hear asylum cases, but only of those who follow the legal routes to and across the border.
So how will the U.S. and Mexico handle the migrant caravan? To find out, in Washington, we are joined by Arturo Sarucan, former Mexican ambassador to the U.S. Also in Washington, we have Basima Al-Ghussan, who is a political analyst of the Truman National Security Project and former advisor to the Obama administration. Finally, in Mexico City, Laura Carlson, director of the Americas program of the Center for International Policy. I want to welcome all of you, ladies and gentlemen, to our program. First of all, Ambassador Sarucan, do you see any solution in sight?
It's going to be a long way away. There are no structural, long-term solutions to the issue of labor and migrant displacement coming from Central America, whether it's due to the security circumstances in Honduras and El Salvador, or to the economic challenges, mainly from the rural sector in Guatemala. What we're seeing on the Mexican-U.S. border today is one century BC solutions to 21st century challenges.
Agree with that terminology, one century BC solution to the 21st century problem. Ms. Carlson, you are in Mexico right now.
Yes, well, I don't know if I would characterize it exactly like that, but it's certainly true that there are no quick fixes to this problem. This is a problem that's been building up for years because of the conditions in Central America, many of them caused by U.S. policies, especially the political crisis in Honduras. As we know, most of these migrants are Honduran. In addition, we have the broken immigration system in the United States, and instead of responding to the need to process asylum cases that are arriving more and more each day, and this has been going on for a long time. It's not just this group that happened to get together in a much larger group than has happened before. Instead of processing those, they're taking a militarized solution, which just aggravates the situation.
Talking about that, we have to go to Ms. Al-Ghussan. Of course, you worked for the former administration. This administration, though, has been characterizing its policy, particularly regarding its policy toward the migrants, very different from the earlier one. So, Ms. Al-Ghussan, how do you see the results so far? Is there any solution in sight from Washington? And remember, it's not just the White House, but also the other parts and branches of the government.
Yes, that is an excellent question, and we have seen a number of inconsistencies in the Trump administration in response to a number of policies. We know that the Trump administration is a strong advocate for building the border wall, but even if President Trump is able to get financial support from Congress, which is highly unlikely now that the Democrats have taken control of the House, the wall wouldn't be constructed for years. And as we know, this is a crisis that's going on at present, although I do think we might see some hope in Mexico with the new president-elect who will be taking office on December 1st. He has made it clear that he's interested in pioneering a sort of Marshall Plan that would lead to investments in the southern part of Mexico to help create jobs and opportunities for the people who are fleeing from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And so it might be worth the United States investment and money to invest in some opportunities for these people to be taken care of properly in Mexico.
I see. So what can the Central American migrants expect really when they reach the Mexico-U.S. border? If you take a look at history, 2018, now 7,000 migrants have walked from Central America to the U.S. border, but their journey is only just the beginning because in 2017, 14,000 Central Americans applied for asylum in the U.S., but only 10% of Central American migrants were eventually accepted. So from there, you could almost tell the fate likely for the current ones arriving at the border. That's only part of the issue. The other issue, of course, Mr. Ambassador, is the relationship between Mexico and the United States. Remember, earlier the trade thing was already quite a hurt to the relationship and the wall, and now you have more.
There's no doubt that President Trump's anti-Mexico tirades over the last year and a half have damaged the relationship, despite yeoman efforts by Mexican and U.S. officials to prevent the wheels falling off from the bilateral relationship. This will be another test. You have an incoming Mexican government that assumes office on Saturday, a government that so far has signaled that it will try and avoid confrontation with the U.S. president. That could be signaling to President Trump that he can push as far as he wants to on this issue of forcing Mexico to host Central American migrants. I was the ambassador who, during my tenure in the last 2 years of the Bush administration and the first full 4 years of the Obama administration, helped develop a concept which has remained as the central tenet of the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship, which is shared responsibility. That is, these are two countries that, to successfully address a host of issues that affect us both, need to work together to jointly address these challenges. And there's no doubt that transmigration from Central America through Mexico on its way to the United States has to be dealt with in an intelligent, holistic fashion by the Mexican government.
Well,
but there has to be a quid pro quo, and seeking to appease President Trump by bending backwards and accepting a policy that will put even more strain on Mexico, on the border, is a huge challenge, particularly if we are unable to develop a long-term vision to generate security and holistic development in Central America to deter the root causes of emigration from that region through Mexico into the U.S.
Well, that has been talked for quite some time. Will that be resolved under the current administration? That probably is a bigger question mark than it used to be. Ms. Carlson, I mean, on the one hand, you heard Mr. Ambassador talking about holistic, long-term, the real root cause. On the other hand, you have the new president in Mexico coming in. That could be a clean sheet. That could be a very good beginning, but the question is next steps to come. Ms. Carlson, how much chance really is there, or on the other hand, how much challenge really is there as a result of this?
It's a very difficult challenge for the new government coming into office in just a few days. They're walking on eggs here. What's the problem is that before there can be shared responsibility, there has to be responsibility. Donald Trump is not taking responsibility for the fact that there are desperate individuals who have a right to seek asylum in the United States, and that many of them are coming as a direct result of U.S. policies in their home countries. Mexico has to take responsibility for their right to transit and for the humanitarian crisis that's being created. So there has to be responsibility on both sides. The problem the new government has is the degree of control of the U.S. government over Mexico. We just saw that in a short tweet by saying that Donald Trump could permanently close the border. He caused the stock market to crash and the peso to fall. This is a leverage that the United States has over Mexico that gives the new government very little room for maneuver, and they're going to have to trace a new policy and a new program, but with difficult circumstances.
We have almost 25 seconds left. Ms. Al-Hussein, I hate to let you go without you having the final comments.
I think that President-elect Lopez Obrador has a wonderful idea in mind. His goal is to start negotiating the potential Marshall Plan that would help address some of the issues both in Mexico and the other Central American countries. The goal is to have the deal done by May of 2019 so that we would see true effects in 2020. And I agree with both of my other colleagues, the ambassador and my fellow scholar, that there are longer-term issues at stake, but we also need to be addressing what's happening now.
Sarul Khan, Al-Hussein, and Carlson, thank you so much for the three of you for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us on social media and also on the internet. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team in Beijing, thanks for watching, and bye for now.